What's good, y'all? What's going on, everybody? Hopefully I'm on the right channel. Hopefully I am. Yeah, I thought that I was on this channel eating breakfast with y'all this morning, but y'all, I was on the wrong channel. So my bad. That's my apologies. Put my headphones away. Yeah. I was wanting to get into this book of Tim Blaine's. And I was like, I could start listening to it by myself. But it really don't make no sense for me to listen to it by myself if I could share it with y'all. And I did. I tried to ask his permission. Timothy Blaine, I did try to ask your permission up in your chat today about this. And at first I was going to start in July. But yeah, I got a couple of hours on my hands. So why not start right now? Y'all, I got my popcorn. We going to listen to chapter 1. Timothy Blaine, I hope you don't get offended. I sent you one Cash App. You should see the Cash App that I sent you. And that way, if you do get offended, at least you know I paid. But just let me know if you get mad, if you get upset. And thank you to everybody for coming in. Y'all, this is Air Pop popcorn. 2 servings of Air Pop popcorn. And I put honey, cinnamon, butter on it. Distant lover, yay. Distant lover, yay. We about to listen to Meth Monster. At least the first chapter. Y'all, I'm intrigued. I want to know. I want to know about Meth Monster. So that's why I came with my popcorn. And my Hugh Hefner robe. I want y'all to get comfortable too. Let's do what it do.
Meth Monster, the story of a resurrected life. Written by Timothy Blaine. Narrated by J. Pritchard.
Press 1 if y'all can hear it.
Chapter 1, Introduction.
Hey, Shay.
Where to begin? Who am I kidding? I don't have a clue as to where to begin writing a book about my life. I'm no writer. It's not likely that I'll ever write any great work of fiction or win any literary awards.
Okay, y'all can hear good.
No, as far as I know, I'm not gifted in that way. But I do, like you, have one story to tell, or in the language that I use today, a testimony. Yesterday morning, I woke up with an almost overwhelming urge to go to my computer, turn it on, sit down, and begin to write this book.
Thank you.
What is interesting to note is that prior to 6 o'clock yesterday morning, I don't remember having even so much as a passing thought of taking on a project such as this. Now, you have to understand something right off the top. It is only because of the Lord that I am sitting at this desk right now. Because if anybody else would have come to my bedroom door at 6 o'clock in the morning talking about writing a book or a letter, or even my name for that matter, I would have questioned their sanity, their sobriety, and possibly their right to live. No, I've learned that when the Lord God says move, I move. Faith without works is dead. No sense in sitting up arguing with the Lord. He already knows how dumb you think you are. He already knows that I type with one finger. And yes, the Lord our God in heaven knows every detail of the story I'm about to tell you. And yet, even with all of that at times damaging information, God loves me. I know that today. He loves me, and he loves you in exactly the same way. It doesn't matter if you're a homeless heroin addict or a televangelist. God loves us all through the blood of Jesus Christ, our only hope of glory. I know that some of you may be thinking, well, we all know that. But do we really? Or have some of us been robbed? Have we been cheated out of our inheritance? Have we allowed the church to cover the Christ with so much religion and opinion that we really don't even know who Jesus Christ really is or what our God has done for us all in him? Well, I can only speak for myself. For most of my life, I didn't know Jesus. I barely even knew who he was. Oh, I knew the Christmas songs, and I've seen images of the baby in the manger for as many years as I've been alive. I even played one of the wise men in my 6th grade Christmas play. Lord knows I've seen and worn the crosses, but know the Lord? The very best I could say was, yes, I believe that there is a God somewhere. A big part of the problem was the fact that from as far back as I can remember, I was homosexual. I'm not talking about finding out during puberty or discovering myself as a teenager or young adult. I'm talking 8 or 9 years old, I knew that I was gay. That's before I even knew what sex was really. I am convinced that homosexuality is not something that you do, it's something that you are. Now, how would anybody react to a religion that has always seemed to take such exceedingly great pleasure in proclaiming that the who you are is sin, plain and simple? I've never seen anything quite like it. I cannot tell you how many times I've been kicking back, watching Christian television, hoping to get a word from the Lord, or at the very least, a word of encouragement, when bam, here we go again. Homosexuality is a sin, an abomination. God hates fags. Turn or burn. And on and on and on. This usually followed by some cruel joke about some out celebrity, or the old standby, Adam and Steve. That followed by a rush of laughter and something akin to joy flowing all through the building. Now, I know that emotional cruelty is not funny to me as an adult, but imagine what effect that must have on an 8 or 9-year-old child. You'd expect it from the other kids. After all, they're just kids. That bullying spirit sits heavily on our young lives. But what about when it comes from the adults, or even worse, from the pulpit? Try as I might, I know that I won't be able to resist challenging some of those self-righteous, condescending, bullying spirits on the subject of winning the world for Christ. However, it is not my intention to try to beat up on the Christian church, or the clergy, or even specific persons whom I feel have hurt me and countless other people like me, or helped to stunt my spiritual growth. The fact is, we all hurt each other. All of humanity has got issues with one another. No, I have no delusions that I'm going to be able to somehow work it out or even to figure it out in these few pages. Only God himself knows why we act the way we do and why we treat each other as badly as we do. Just as surely as he knew that he could depend on humanity to brutally murder his only son, God knows us. No, all I'm going to attempt to do here, listener, is to tell you my story. My prayer is that I will be able to do so without turning this endeavor into a forum for venting all of my hurt, frustration, and resentment. Of course, some of that is part of my truth. But for me to sit here and try to blame the Christian church or society or even the devil himself, although I'm sure that he had a hand in it, for nearly 25 years of waste, drug addiction, criminal activity, and multiple incarcerations would be much more than a stretch. It would be an out-and-out lie. The truth of the matter is, I got hooked on crystal methamphetamine because 1, I tried it. 2, I liked it. And 3, I kept on doing it. Sure, it could be debated that the circumstances of my childhood, my lack of self-worth, and a series of bad choices and decisions might have easily culminated in a perfect storm for me to turn to drugs and alcohol. But in all honesty, that's just not the way that I remember the story. More like, I went to the party one night and never came back. In this story, I'm going to tell you about the party, about the dope, the crime, the prisons, and eventually how and why I believe I got AIDS. All of that, of course, after I spend a couple of chapters telling you who I am and where I came from. And then there's going to be a shift. Hallelujah. Then I'm going to get a chance to tell you about what I really want to tell you about the only thing that brings joy to my soul and deliverance to my mind and body, about a hope alive within me that defies explanation. I'm going to get my big chance to tell somebody about my one-on-one personal encounter with the Spirit of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Oh yes, he really is good news, and he's good news for everybody, not just those who claim to be the righteous ones. If I were pushed to liken myself and my spiritual experience to any one character in the Bible, it would have to be the man who was born blind in John 9. After Jesus had healed the man, the very religious Pharisees approached him, accusing the Christ of being a sinner because he healed him on the Sabbath. With that, the man began his answer with a simple yet profound truth. I don't know if he is a sinner or not. All I know is that I was blind, but now I can see.
I'm on the right channel now.
The key word for me in this simple statement is no. This man was not in the least bit uncertain about three important points in this statement. First, he knew with absolute certainty that he was born blind. Second, he was just as certain that he could see the people he was standing there talking to. And the third important point in this simple statement is in the way that the man begins. I don't know if he is a sinner or not. Herein lays yet another difference between religion and faith. This man wasn't the least bit concerned about sin, or what the Pharisees viewed as sin, and neither was Jesus. I would venture to say that after this one encounter with the Son of God, this man who was born blind had something that the religious fanatics would never have. This man knew God in the person of Jesus Christ. This kind of knowing was almost certainly based solely on the intimate knowledge that Jesus had done something for him that he knew was impossible. Is it no wonder that Jesus chose to first strike Saul of Tarsus blind and then to heal him? He didn't have to do that, you know. Jesus was given all power and authority over heaven and earth. He could have called Saul in any way he wanted to. But for some reason, Jesus, with all the wisdom of heaven, chose to first strike Saul blind, then to promise him his sight back, and then to deliver on what he promised. Because Saul was delivered, we now have the teachings of the Apostle Paul, and about 2/3 of the New Testament. Without ever meeting Paul, I know in my heart that there were many times when he must have taken his mind right back to that Damascus road, back to the place where he first encountered the Spirit of Jesus. Yes, he whom the Son sets free is free indeed. I'm here to share my experience and to encourage anyone who might need encouragement right about now. There really is a way out. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Now, was the Son of God talking about being the way out of the crack house here? Or was he talking maybe about being the way out of addiction to internet pornography? Or perhaps Jesus was talking about being the way to stop beating your spouse, or the way to stop drinking, or smoking, or shooting heroin, or. It seems like we just keep coming up with more and more ors. To all these things and to everything else that crawls on or beneath the earth, I declare that Jesus Christ is the way. The way to what? The way to knowing God. This is the true deliverance, knowing God. Now, I was at a popular hangout for the recovery community here in San Francisco just last night when, bam, the enemy attacked. I know that it was him because he oftentimes shows up in a spirit of fear and self-doubt. Boy, you can't write no book like that, he said. All this talk about Jesus being the way and making it sound like that's the only way somebody can know God. Listen to what the people are saying. And sure enough, the thing was right. Isn't that just like him to always use just a grain of truth? Just about everyone in the place was talking about God. Granted, most were using the term higher power. But just think about how many names were given to God in the Hebrew Bible alone. No, there was something going on there last night. Something that I was supposed to get. So as I was standing around, by this time deliberately listening to the conversations around me, hearing former drug addicts and alcoholics, many clean now for 10 or 15 years, talking about turning their will and their lives over to the care of God as they understood him, talking about prayer, meditation, and surrender, I thought, Lord, what about that? You said yourself in John 14:6 that you were the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one could come to the Father without you. Why did you say that, Master? All we do is fight about it here. And what about the Jews, and the Muslims, and the Hindus, and the Buddhists, and all of the other religions of the world? Who's right about you? Why have so many people around the world throughout history been willing to die for their faith if most of it means nothing? Shouldn't the Holy Spirit have spoken to all of these misguided souls by now and told them that Jesus is the only way? I don't understand. And I've never spoken a truer word, listener. God is far too vast and majestic to fit into any box, book, or religion that either you or I would try to fit him into. I'm not going to pretend that I understand the unseen things of God and his purposes. I don't know where he lives or where he came from any more than I understand why most people are heterosexual and some people are homosexual, or why he chose to have so many different races and allows for so many religions to flourish. No, I'll have to leave all of that kind of talk to the theologians and the people who have made it their life's work to study the written words. As for me, well, I'm a lot like that blind man in John 9. All I know is that I was blind and now I can see. Or in my case, all I know for sure is that I was a hopeless drug addict lying in a prison cell waiting to die, and now I'm not. Walk with me. I want to tell you what happened. Chapter 2,
Oh, wow.
Easter Sunday, 1958.
Oh, wow. Wait, we already at chapter 2, y'all.
Well,
Hold
you can
on.
relax, listener. I'm not going to try to tie some deep
Right.
spiritual meaning to the fact that I was born on
Tim
Easter
Blaine,
Sunday.
Wait, Tim
But
Blaine,
nevertheless, that's what happened.
Wait.
The way my mother tells it,
Look. Tim Blaine, you gotta wait.
she was in church praising the Lord when she...
Look, I only told these people we was gonna go through chapter 1. I didn't even finish my popcorn yet. Press 1 if y'all want to go on through chapter 2 with me. Press 2 if y'all want to wait. Because Tim Blaine got a story to tell. And that quick. What's good, Johnny Cage? And that quick, we already at chapter 2, y'all. Because I only put chapter 1 up in this title. But I'll edit the title. Okay, so I saw 2 and I saw 1. And I see 1s. Okay, we'll go through chapter 2, y'all, and then we'll be done. At least for right now. Which maybe I may try to do this. My idea is to do like Wisdom Wednesday. And we could listen to Hey Tanya Jones. And we can listen to Tim give wisdom for Wisdom Wednesday. So I wanted to start this off with chapter 1 today, just to see how many people is going to receive it well. But I'm thinking that we're going to continue it on Wednesdays until we finish the book. And then we'll come with another book too after. Hey, DVD. Yeah, Johnny Cage. Tim Blaine talking about, his life and stuff and him being a homosexual and things like that. Which I will say, I think when you are a gay person in America, and especially a gay Black person, I feel like we all have the same journey, the same type of conflicts, internal conflicts. Because when you are gay and you are raised in a Black family by Black people, a lot of times they instill certain things in you to where it makes you think that you are wrong, or that you are a mistake, or that you are, an anomaly. And in this book so far, I done heard Tim kind of relate to that. And I believe that gay Black people do have that issue because the people around us make us feel like we are not, like they make us feel like just we are not worthy sometimes, like you just shouldn't be that way. But either way, it's good to listen to him. But okay, we'll go through chapter 2. So chapter 2, let's carry on.
She went into labor. Mother was 17 years old and unmarried.
Hold on.
We lived in Indianapolis. Chapter 2, Easter Sunday, 1958. Well, you can relax, listener. I'm not going to try to tie some deep spiritual meaning to the fact that I was born on Easter Sunday. But nevertheless, that's what happened. The way my mother tells it, she was in church praising the Lord when she went into labor. Mother was 17 years old and unmarried. We lived in Indianapolis, Indiana. We were, without a doubt, poor, but not much poorer than most Black folks at that time. Of course, I was barely aware of what was going on back then, what with being a baby and all. But over the years, I must have heard it all at least 100 times or more. You see, I'm from one of those big African-American families. Grandmother had 9 children, 5 boys and 4 girls. And of course, all of them had children too. Yes, my grandmother's house was always full of people, and we celebrated everything together. Thanksgiving, Christmas Eve, the 4th of July, and pretty much anything else my grandmother was willing to cook for. Make no mistake about it, if my grandmother was cooking, everybody was coming. To this very day, one tradition stands firm in that family. At some point, the adults separate and start up a conversation about the good old days and how poor they were. Back then, I never did quite get how they could recall the very worst of economic circumstances and then identify those days as the good old days. I say they because this conversation was only for the generation before me. My generation didn't know what poor was. In my family, you had to really know poor to talk about poor. So this is the way that I was able to piece together most of what I know about the early beginnings of my life. Of course, as in most families, there are some things that no one wants to talk about. Isn't it strange how those are the very things I remember best? But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here already. I need to go back just a little bit. When I was a little past my first birthday, my mother got married. You would think that this would be good news, what with her being an unwed mother and all. Mother should have been finishing up high school in 1959. Instead, here she was, 18 years old, with a 1-year-old baby and no husband. I never did get the story straight about my natural father. I do have a vague memory of meeting him, so maybe he stopped by to see me once before he took off. Mother never once badmouthed him, so I figured that they must have just been a couple of teenagers who got in trouble, and according to my mother, on her very first time around. No hard feelings, but no family. Then along came a spider and sat down beside her. If only my mother would have run away. Didn't she know that spiders bite? Billy Jackson, not his real name, was to be my mother's first husband. Tall, dark, and I guess many women would say handsome. A real slickster, that Billy Jackson. Dark skin, shiny white teeth, shiny processed hair, shiny shoes and fingernails. Yeah, I guess you could say that pretty much everything about Billy Jackson was shiny. Everything except for his eyes. There was something about that man's eyes that sends a chill through me even now. If it's true, as they say, that the eyes are the windows to the soul, then Billy Jackson's soul was a dark and scary thing. Maybe that's why he always tried to keep his outside so shiny. Billy was from San Francisco, and maybe that was part of the attraction. Maybe my mother saw Billy as her ticket out of Nap Town, Indianapolis, and her current circumstances. Or maybe she really did love him. I don't know what the motivation was. I only know what happened. They met, got married, had a little girl, and then off the 4 of us went to San Francisco, California. I'm not sure exactly how long after we arrived in California that the beatings started, but start they did. Billy was a cruel and brutal wife beater. There were probably already danger signals going off long before we left Indianapolis, but there my mother had her 5 brothers. Now we were over 2,000 miles away, living in Billy's hometown. No brothers and no witnesses, at least not any that knew or cared anything about my mother. The gloves came off. The clearest memory I have about the time we spent in California was of a hellish ride on a Bay Area freeway. We had been visiting with one of my stepfather's relatives when the fight broke out. Of course, in front of the relatives and in their house, there was only yelling and screaming. But we all knew what was coming once we got home. This time, we didn't make it that far. Billy was driving fast, really fast, yelling and screaming at my mother, weaving in and out of lanes, driving faster and faster as he got madder and madder. Me and my sister were screaming and crying in the back seat. Suddenly, Billy snapped, lunging at my mother, punching her in the face repeatedly, all the while driving with one hand and weaving back and forth between lanes. Panicking, I opened the back door and was trying to jump out of the fast-moving car when somehow one or the other of them must have caught my shirt. I still remember the details of that nightmarish night 43 years later. Of course, the incident and many others like it traumatized me, but I have long since given up trying to figure out exactly how much damage was done to my young psyche by being raised in that environment. To be sure, whatever it was like for me, it was much worse for my mother. Billy was not into beating children. In fact, I don't even remember ever being spanked by him. Nevertheless, I could never understand how he could treat my mother the way he did, and still somehow think that we were friends. We were never friends. I hated Billy Jackson. How could he have not known that I would hate him? We only stayed in San Francisco for about 3 years, and in that time, my second little sister was born. How my mother loved that little baby. She and the baby were both what the Southern folks would call high yellow. My first sister looked just like her daddy, and now this new baby looked just like her mother, and our dysfunctional parents chose their favorite accordingly. Then there was me, Timothy. I was neutral. I didn't remind anybody of anybody. So after 3 years of being Billy's punching bag, my mother started planning her escape. But you couldn't just leave Billy Jackson. We definitely had to escape. If he caught her trying to get away, he'd put her in the hospital or worse. We couldn't very well go back to Indianapolis. That would be the very first place that he'd come looking for us. No, Indy was definitely out. But there were relatives on my mother's side living in New York, and looking back, I assumed Billy knew nothing about them. At any rate, when Billy went to work at the naval shipyards early one morning, as he always did, my mother grabbed her purse, a bag of clothes, her 3 children, and hid it. By the time Billy was breaking for lunch, the 4 of us were sitting on a train headed for New York City. I wouldn't have put it past old Billy Jackson to try to catch up with the Greyhound. I wonder if my mother was thinking the same thing when she bought those train tickets. New York was great. We moved to Long Island. I was 6 years old. Can't say that I remember much of the city now, but I sure liked those New York relatives. They were so nice to us kids, and it was really great seeing people be nice to my mom too. But of course, the best part about being in New York was being away from that monster, Billy Jackson. You can imagine the horror I felt when a year later he showed up. Billy was there in New York City with us. Of course, the same thing started up again, and before I knew it, we were living back in Indianapolis, and Billy was living with us. My young mind couldn't comprehend any of this. What was wrong with my mother? Didn't she hate him as much as I did? When was this going to stop? Was Billy going to kill my mother? Finally, when I was 8 years old, my mother and her husband broke up for the very last time. I could finally exhale. I remember feeling like I had been holding my breath for my entire life. That may sound like a bit of an exaggeration, but to be sure, I was never able to totally relax in that house. Violence could erupt without a moment's notice. Sure, it would have been nice to have a dad around, but I never saw Billy in that way. If there was one thing that I could say that I was proud of as a child, it was that Billy Jackson was not my real father. After the divorce, my mother told me that I could actually change my last name back to what it was before she married him, and I jumped at the chance. Unfortunately, this reprieve was not to last for very long. Within a year of my mother's split from Billy Jackson, she went and got herself a boyfriend. Can't say that I can blame her much. Her marriage had been more like being in a war than a relationship. Theo, not his real name either, must have looked pretty good to my mother. A real nice guy who loved kids, kind of average looking, not flashy and all shiny like Billy. Theo was one of those hard-working types who wore sweatshirts and loved baseball. To look at him, you never would have thought that on the inside, Theo was not much different from Billy Jackson. Mother was back on the front lines in no time flat. This time, however, her brothers armed themselves and took turns sleeping at our house. Eventually, Theo decided to move on, but only after 3 more years of my impressionable youth had been spent walking around on pins and needles. Maybe if my mother would have just survived a very bad marriage and then was alone for a while, and then maybe met a different kind of guy somewhere down the line, she would have been fine. But that's just not the way it happened. And my mother was not fine. None of us were. Mother was left bitter and hostile, especially towards men, all men. And I was the only male around. As far as my mother was concerned, all black men had the same first name, nigga. Those few years after she broke up with Theo were hellish. The tiniest little thing would set her off. I had always lived in fear of my mother's men going off on her. Now the tables had turned. Now I was the one being beaten. To make matters worse, it was right around this same time that I started feeling like there was something very different about me. Actually, I had been feeling this way for about a year before Theo took off, since I was 9. Now, I know that the psychological types are going to start analyzing the details of my family dynamics here, but as far as I know, there has never been any connection made between homosexuality and violence in the home. What is very interesting to me now about this period of my development is that I don't remember it being very sexual. Sure, I messed around a little with the neighborhood kids, but I don't think I did any more than anybody else at that age. I don't think any of us ever actually even touched each other. No, this was something very different from that. This had much more to do with who I was as opposed to what I did. It's very hard to put this kind of awareness into words, especially nearly 40 years after the fact, but all I can do is try. It wasn't that I was effeminate, but at the same time, I wasn't quite as masculine as the other boys my age either. As I recall, I didn't particularly care for either football or hopscotch. The nickname my family gave me was Timid Timothy, and a truer nickname was never given. I'd cry over just about anything. Whatever the cause, no one could deny that I was an unusually sensitive child. Another thing that I remember with painful and absolute clarity is the fact that no matter what the other kids would say or do to me, I would never, ever fight back. The very thought of any kind of violence would send me running for my mama. And boy, how she hated that. When I was 11 years old, there was another interesting change. Me, my mother, and my 2 sisters packed up and moved into the Emerson Greens housing project. As a rule, the projects are not a place for a lot of whining and crying, and no one was wanting to hear any of that sensitive kid crap either. Every day on the way to school, I either had to toughen up or get punched in the nose. But what I was amazed to find out was that I could adapt. No, I was never going to convince anybody that I was a tough kid, but boy, could I make them laugh. What I discovered at 11 years old was that if I could make people laugh, I could make them like me. And if I could make them like me, they wouldn't want to beat me up. As Richard Pryor once said, all I had to do was keep them laughing. This was not a bad thing at the time. I just loved acting a fool. The more I harassed the teachers, the more popular I became. Of course, this didn't sit well with the teachers or with my mother, but I didn't care. No one understood what it was like to be me. Besides, just as soon as I was old enough, I was going to quit school anyway. I hated it there. The Emerson Greens were located way out near the edge of town, surrounded by 2 trailer parks, a cemetery, and the state mental hospital. Talk about your diverse communities. But the best part about living there was that it was built right alongside of Fall Creek. Me and 3 close friends must have spent over half of our waking hours in and around that creek. It connected to everything. One day we followed the creek to the local drive-in theater. As I recall, we snuck in as usual. We were too young to get in legitimately, even if we did have any money. But on this particular day, as we made our way out, a middle-aged white man approached us. Of course, we thought we were in big trouble now. He said his name was Ken and that he wasn't a security guard. Ken was a pedophile. Out of respect for the other people involved, I'm only going to talk about what happened to me. This man was some kind of traveling contractor. His modus operandi was to seduce his victims slowly, with money, gifts, and lots of takeout food. Then, after about 2 or 3 weeks, on the night before he was to leave town, he'd make his move. Of course, if anybody did tell or call the cops, he'd be long gone by morning. I can still remember the look on his face when I told him that I thought I might be gay. This pervert was not looking for gay. What he wanted was my innocence. There was nothing gay about it. Nevertheless, this was my first time having sex to ejaculation, so I guess he got what he wanted. The next day when we went back, Ken had checked out, and the motel manager told us that the police had been called. We took off, of course, and fast. I don't know what the full effect of this single encounter was on my young mind. At 12, I was having a ball, playing with my friends in the creek, customizing our bicycles, terrorizing my little sisters. Things were finally going well for me. Then along came this spider. Because I have no desire to be anything but totally honest here, I have to say that I don't believe that this pedophile had anything to do with me being gay. I was already gay long before he rolled up. I just hadn't had sex yet. No, I think that possibly the worst damage this pervert did to me was that he taught me what it was to ejaculate. After a boy learns about that, well, it's not like he can just forget about it. When the guys started going into puberty a couple of years later, I didn't get it. What was the big deal? I had been masturbating since the 7th grade. Since the night it happened. After 3 years of living there in the projects, Mother got blessed. She bought her own home. It wasn't a big house, but boy was it nice. A lot nicer than living in the projects. The thing about the projects was, when I was a little kid, it was great. I had a lot of fun, and I really grew up a lot there. But now I was 13 or 14 and starting to get into some bigger trouble. You see, you had to keep up with what was going on around you, and I felt like this was especially true for me. With every passing day, it seemed like I was becoming more and more aware of my differentness. In order to maintain my status as one of the boys, I felt like I had to always do more than anybody else. Since I wasn't the least bit inclined towards sports, I found other ways to excel. When we went to the supermarkets, I always stole more than anybody else. Same thing with the malls, the lumber yards, and the 5 and dimes. I'd steal anything that wasn't attached to something. Yeah, this was a good time for us to move. I was on the fast track to some real trouble with the law. And you know what? It worked. From the moment I put the sheets on my new bed in our new home, my life of crime was over. Oh, happy day. How my mother must have rejoiced over signing that mortgage. She had come a long way since her divorce, and in more ways than one. One of the first things she did after we moved was to promise me that she would never hit me again, and she never did. Of course, I was getting to be a very big boy by then, my full 6 feet by age 13. But still, there was something in her eyes that said that she knew that the way she had been treating me was wrong. This was about as close as I was ever going to get to my mother saying, "I'm sorry." I can't say that it was all her fault, though. She was already picking me up at the police station when I was 11. And not only was I stealing everything I could get my hands on around the neighborhood, I had been hitting my mother's pocketbook since I was 8. No, sensitive kid or not, I was no angel. I'm sure that pretty much any single mother would have been somewhat challenged in trying to parent me alone. And now all of that was behind us. I wonder if somebody was praying for me way back then. Well, that would have had to have been my grandmother. This was many years before my mother found the Lord. Grandmother was always praying for everybody. She was an old-time preacher's kid from the South, and my grandmother had always been in church. Grandmother must have spent more time on her knees before the Lord in those days than most people spent on their feet. As I said, there were a lot of us. Usually the teenage years are the time for rebellion and mischief. Not so in my case. I had always been rebellious and mischievous, but now I seem to be conforming. Got my first job at 15, right along with my first car and my first girlfriend. Make that my first and only girlfriend. My girlfriend Lana, not her real name. Now that's an interesting story. As I sit here today trying with all of my heart to tell the absolute truth, I have to admit that I'm not really sure what the truth was here. There are two possibilities. Either I fell in puppy love with Lana, in very much the same way that any other 15-year-old boy falls in love with a girl for the first time, or, for my own sanity and for appearance's sake, I very much needed to divert attention from this whole gay issue. I suspect that it was probably a little bit of both. I'll be the first to admit that I was probably getting a little paranoid about this whole gay thing right around the time that Lana and I hooked up. Could people tell just by looking at me, I wondered? My mother was always making comments about certain actors on TV having fag lips. Was she baiting me? Was there something wrong with my mouth? Well, be that as it may, by the time Lana and I finally got around to attempting to do the thing, I knew with absolute certainty that I was gay. In fact, I had this revelation while I was still lying on top of her. That would prove to be my very first and last attempt at having sex with a member of the opposite sex. Even though I was no longer getting into a lot of trouble, I was still having issues. For as long as I could remember, I had been planning on quitting school, just as soon as I was of age. Well, the legal age to quit school in Indiana was 16, and I had been secretly coveting that birthday probably since the day I started kindergarten. Well, maybe not that far back, but pretty close. This became a self-fulfilling prophecy. A little before my 16th birthday, I quit. This was to be the beginning of a lifetime pattern. Whenever I didn't like something, for whatever reason, I simply quit. Thankfully, this didn't last, however. By the following year, I was back in school, and to everyone's amazement, including mine, this time, instead of getting all C's, D's, and F's, I was getting mostly A's and a few B's. All of a sudden, I loved school. Maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I was the one in charge, that I was there because I wanted to be, not because I had to be. Whatever my teenage rationalization, I was back and doing better than anyone ever dreamed I would. I was even making friends again. There had been a drought since I left my buddies back in the projects. The only problem was gym class. It's hard to hide certain things when you're completely naked, and because of this, I defiantly refused to go to gym class. No, that does not make me a pervert. I'd like to see how well the straight boys would hold up trying to get dressed in the girls' locker room. No, that was one F that I just have to learn to live with. Somewhere down the line, I was going to have to figure something out to deal with this, though. You couldn't graduate without passing PE, and you couldn't take PE in your street clothes. As it turned out, I wouldn't have to figure anything out after all. This is the way that I remember my first time getting drunk. When I came back to high school in 1974, I was a little older than my classmates. I had been held back once way back in the 3rd grade when we moved back to Indianapolis, and now I had missed a full year of high school. The only good thing about this situation was that I had my driver's license before anybody else. Even more importantly, I was the first dude in my grade to get his own wheels. This, of course, made me instantly popular. I had just gotten this great big old 69 Chrysler New Yorker, and one night 5 or 6 of us decided to break that baby in. I can't say that I remember exactly who brought out the alcohol, but that magical night ended when I wrapped that big Chrysler around a tree. One of us was seriously hurt, and the car was totaled. I was 17 years old, and this was already the second car I had totaled. After the accident, I couldn't bring myself to return to school. After all, there was a kid still in the hospital. I was the driver. I was the older one. How could I have been so irresponsible? No one would ever get to ask me those questions. I simply never went back to school. This time really was to be the end of my formal education and also the end of my drinking. Or so I thought. When I was 19, I moved out of my mother's house and got myself a little apartment a few blocks away. Almost immediately, I realized that this was not going to be enough. You see, I was never going to fit in that world. In short order, my sister was going to be getting married. Then, a little bit further down the road, my other sister would get married. And of course, all of the cousins would get married. Then they'd all start having babies and buying houses. Probably most would go to church together. The men would sit around watching sports, and they'd all laugh and joke and talk about the same things. But what about me? Where was I supposed to fit into this new African-American middle-class utopia? Maybe I could run around and help everybody decorate. Don't laugh. I was already starting to do that before I left. Or maybe I could just stay in the closet and keep pretending that I just hadn't found the right girl yet. Or even better, maybe I could just go ahead and marry some poor girl, knowing full well that I was incapable of loving her, at least not in the way that a person deserves to be loved. No, even then, I thought that would be the very worst thing to do, the cruelest and most selfish thing to do. No, I was a grown man now, sort of, and it was time for me to get out there and find out where I fit in. Sure, I could have just stayed there in Indianapolis. There are plenty of gay people in Indianapolis. It's not like I was from a small town. But somehow, that simply was not an option for me. The only way I was ever really going to be free was to leave. After I came to that conclusion, there was not any real choosing process. There was only one place on the planet that I had any interest in living. I was on my way to Los Angeles, California.
Oh, wow.
Chapter 3.
Y'all, we at chapter 3 now. Hold on. Hold on. Tim Blaine. Come through, Tim Blaine.
I got a jaywalking.
Hold on, y'all. We at chapter 3 now. We at chapter 3, y'all. What's good to everybody that came in? Black Butterfly, Johnny Cage, everybody. Y'all, I only put chapter 1. But chapter 1 went by so quickly, then we did chapter 2. And now we just finished with chapter 2 right now. Now he about to do chapter 3. Which ZT was saying that he wanted to do chapter 3. I don't know, y'all. Because I'm thinking maybe 2 chapters at a time is best. Because I'm going to come back, y'all. I'm going to come back on Wednesday. I'm thinking I'm going to do Wisdom Wednesday. I can't do it tomorrow night. Because me and Houston Brad do Dykes on the Loose. So we got Dykes on the Loose on my main channel. But Johnny Cage said this is my thing. Oh, ZT talk about girl, let's get juicy. Well, ZT, I've been eating this damn popcorn. Look, I'm gonna have to go get some water. I'll keep cleaning, but I'm gonna have to go get some water, y'all. I have to step off camera. But I'll go through chapter 3. And at chapter 3, we done until Wednesday, y'all. We done until Wednesday. Okay, so let me do chapter 3. Since ZT up in here trying to throw a temper tantrum.
Ticket just as I was. The only way I was ever really going to be free was to leave. After I came to that conclusion, There was not any real choosing process. There was only one place on the planet that I had any interest in living.
I'm going to go off camera, but I'm still here.
I was on my way to Los Angeles, California. Chapter 3. Hooray for Hollywood. I got a jaywalking ticket just as I was coming out of the Greyhound bus station. In town, not even 15 minutes, and already I was talking to the cops. Was this some kind of omen? Well, if the Lord was trying to tell me something, I definitely was not listening. I already had way too much on my mind. For one thing, I didn't know a single solitary soul in LA. Second, I had a total of $37 in my pocket. Third, I didn't have a clue where I was going to sleep that night. And fourth, it was raining and hard. Oh well, I thought, I already knew it was going to be rough. No sense in whining about it now. First things first, which way is Hollywood? That was the one thing that I was very clear about. I had no interest in the rest of Los Angeles. I knew exactly where I wanted to be. You see, mixed in with all of my California dreamin' was a childlike desire to make it big in show business. This just tickles me today, because I can't for the life of me figure out exactly what part of the business I thought I was going to make it big in. I couldn't sing, I couldn't dance, I couldn't act, juggle, or do magic tricks. No, I was either clinically delusional, or I was trying very hard to convince myself and everybody around me that there was some practical reason behind my need to live in Hollywood. When I arrived at the corner of Hollywood and Vine in the midst of that rainstorm in the summer of 1977, I couldn't believe my eyes. I didn't even want to get off the bus. This was terrible. I don't know exactly what I was expecting, but it sure wasn't this. Nothing but soaking wet homeless people, hookers, hustlers, drug addicts, and drag queens. So this is what Hollywood Boulevard was off camera, I thought. There was certainly nothing glamorous about it, and that is a gross understatement. Sleazy is the word. I can still remember walking up and down the boulevard in the rain that first night, not knowing where I was going, or what I was even doing there, really. What kind of a person just hops on a bus and comes to a place like this with no money and no place to live? I asked myself. It doesn't make sense. But I never once thought of going back to Indiana. There was no going back. I absolutely had to make it here. It must have been on my second or third time down the length of the boulevard that I met Johnny. And believe it or not, it was just that simple. I moved into his apartment that very same night. Actually, there were quite a few people living in Johnny's apartment. They were a band of black gay Buddhists from Chicago. Not only were they black and gay and Buddhist, they were also entertainers. Their big claim to fame was that they hadn't been gonged on the Gong Show. Their stage routine was very funny, but to me, they were just funny people. They all called each other Miss Thang or girlfriend or Mary or just plain girl. It seemed like every third word was honey. This took a little getting used to, and yet I found it not only very funny, but a reasonable act of rebellion. Man, how I would chuckle when I was introduced to people like Miss Fred or Miss Charles. These guys were hysterical to me. They seemed to elevate camp to an art form. So in my first couple of hours in Hollywood, I had gotten lucky. Things could have gone a lot differently. I would have done anything to stay in LA. After the first couple of days, my opinion of Hollywood Boulevard changed dramatically. Whereas at first glance it had somewhat resembled a cesspool, now it appeared to be the most exciting place on earth. It sure makes a difference, I guess, knowing where you're going to sleep at night. That, plus the rain had stopped. This was the beginning of a very exciting time for me, a time of self-discovery and exploration, and I was not alone. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of young people like me everywhere I looked. This was a whole lot different than the 3 or 4 gay people I could identify at my high school who I wouldn't even so much as speak to for fear of guilt by association. Finally, I didn't have to hide or be ashamed. Not anymore. This, I thought, was the place where I would build my life. It was after just a couple of months at Johnny's place that I met my first celebrity. Actually, this guy didn't have a lot of personal celebrity, but boy, what a client list he had. He was a costume designer, and through him, I actually got to see some of the glamorous side of Hollywood. I had only been in town 2 or 3 months, and already I was meeting and sometimes holding conversations with practically every R&B singing group that I had ever listened to. This was pretty heady stuff for a 19-year-old boy fresh off the bus from Indiana. For a while there, it just seemed like I could do no wrong. This guy even helped me to get my own apartment. I lived right off of the boulevard, almost directly behind Mann's Chinese Theater. I couldn't have asked for a better first year in Los Angeles. I was having a very good time. I should note here that up to this point, I had had no need or desire to do drugs. I had gotten drunk a couple of times in Indiana, most notably the time that I wrecked the Chrysler, and I had smoked pot occasionally if it was offered to me. But I don't remember ever having had a desire to get high, and I certainly never went out and bought drugs on my own. My designer friend and his crowd smoked a lot of pot, and because I spent pretty much every weekend up at his house for over a year, there was plenty of opportunity and unlimited supply. But still, it didn't really take. Drugs were just not that big a deal for me. I was still getting high on just being in LA, and on being there on my own. Besides, every time I smoked pot, I fell asleep. Sleeping all day was the last thing I wanted. I didn't want to miss anything. All of that was about to change. When I was almost 21, I met my first lover. That was the language of the day. Today we would have been called partners. Maybe soon that word will change again. But in the late 70s, the only term used to describe two men who loved each other and lived together was lovers. David and I met at the Hollywood Spa. This was a few years before the AIDS epidemic hit the US, so at that time the bathhouses were still an integral part of the gay experience. You couldn't get into the bars and discos until you were 21, but you only had to be 18 to get into a bathhouse. David was a 20-year-old white guy with a huge blonde afro. No, there was nothing ethnic about him. He just had very long, very curly, bleach blonde hair, which he picked out for maximum effect. We were together from the very first day we met. David had been around the gay scene a lot longer than I had, even though we were both not yet 21. The way he told it, he had always been out. He simply was not the kind of kid that could hide it. His parents had kicked him out of the house at 14, and he had basically been on the streets or in foster care ever since. I found him kind of sad, kind of tragic, and very easy to love. David was also a drug addict. Mostly it was pot and tequila around the time that we met, but that man would drink, snort, pop, or smoke just about anything he got his hands on to stay high. And it didn't take long for me to catch up with him. Smoking pot was always the first thing we did in the morning, and the very last thing we did at night. Whereas it used to put me right to sleep, now it was the reason that I got up in the morning. In fact, if there was no pot in the house to wake up to, I simply would not go to bed at all. And instead, I would prowl around the streets of Hollywood all night, which is where I stumbled into my next line of work. I was naive, yes, but not so naive that I didn't know that there was money to be made as a male prostitute. In fact, if the truth be told, that had been my backup plan ever since the day I left Indianapolis. But somehow I had just never been able to bring myself to actually do it. There never seemed to be any real need to do it. After all, I had gotten quite a bit of help since I got to town. But that was different. Those guys knew what I needed and just gave it to me. I didn't ask them for anything. Besides, people like the designer guy had plenty of money, and they liked spending it. It's only natural, I suppose, to want to help young people. But now I was contemplating actually getting in cars with strangers and having sex in exchange for money. In my right mind, I couldn't have brought myself to do it, but I wasn't in my right mind anymore. I was high all the time, and being high all the time took cash. Fortunately for me, David absolutely despised prostitution. As a kid living on the streets of LA, he'd had to do it just to survive. He knew the life well, too well, and there was no way that I was going to be with him, he said, and be out there turning tricks. We fought about it a lot, and after a while I gave it up. It helped that David had come up with another more brilliant idea. He got a job. Looking back, of course, it seems like getting a job should have been a given, especially for someone with my background where everybody over the age of 16 worked somewhere, at least part-time. And trust, as soon as school was out, you had to go out and get a real job, man. We all knew the scripture. If a man don't work, he don't eat, right? Well, that might be what was right, but let me tell you, I, for one, had absolutely no interest in working for a living. I was having way too much fun. Had I come all the way out to California just to get a job? To work 8 or 10 hours somewhere, come home, eat dinner, watch a movie, and go to bed? I could have done that in Indiana. Besides, when would I have time to get high with a schedule like that? No, working was definitely out, but I still needed money. You see, David and I had come to an uneasy, and for the most part unspoken, agreement. Basically, he worked and paid most of the bills, while I supplied the drugs. This arrangement was not nearly as unequal as you might think, since our drug bill far exceeded our living expenses. By this time, we were doing copious amounts of LSD, MDA, Quaaludes, Black Beauties, angel dust, mescaline, alcohol, and weed. Actually, David was doing most of the drinking. At that point, I hated the taste of alcohol. How that dude ever made it to work every morning, I'll never know. He did manage to lose quite a few jobs, but he never stopped trying. He'd lose a job one week, and then a couple of weeks later, he'd be working someplace else. That was David's hustle. As for me, I did a lot better in the streets. At first, it was enough to just sell joints and dime bags of weed on the boulevard. But before long, I was back to doing what I did so well as a kid back in the projects. Once again, I found myself back in the department stores. Only this time, I wasn't stealing for kicks or status. This time, I was in it purely for the money. So that's the way that my first lover, David, and I lived for the remainder of our relationship. He'd go to work every morning, and I'd go out stealing. Of course, I had to open up shop at night to fence all of my loot and to barter with the drug dealers. Boosting was a double-edged sword. First, you had to acquire the merchandise, and then you had to turn it into cash or drugs. Most of the time, if I couldn't get the money directly from the stores, I had to barter the merchandise for drugs and then sell some of the drugs for cash. This was a lot of activity going on under one roof, and of course, before long, resentment and tension started building between us. You see, all David got for going to work every day and trying to do what most people would consider the right thing was a paycheck. I, on the other hand, was becoming very popular and actually thriving in this new criminal persona I had taken on. Whenever the phone rang, it was for me. If there was a knock at the door, it was for me. If someone dropped a package off, it was always for me. Before long, our apartment seemed more like a 7-Eleven store than a place where people lived. The only time the doorbell was for him, it was the landlord looking for the rent. Of course, inevitably, all of my money was tied up in the drugs. The icing on the cake was when I started going to jail. Not only did this leave David alone and feeling abandoned, it instantly cut off his seemingly endless supply of dope. This was an impossible situation. It was like trying to mix oil and water, and it was about to get much worse. David and I had just turned 21, he in March and me in April. We had been able to sneak into the bars a little here and there before this, but the law and the bar owners were very strict about carding. This was especially true in dealing with black folks. Oh yes, we were all gay, but we were not all the same. at least not on that playing field. The majority still ran everything, and I was about to learn some very harsh and painful realities about life in my new so-called community and about human nature in general. But I'll get back to that. David and I started pouring alcohol onto this already smoldering flame of resentment burning into our dysfunctional relationship. I know that somewhere long ago, society decided that alcohol is okay and drugs are not. But I have to tell you that the effects of alcohol on our relationship and on me personally far exceeded anything I had ever experienced while under the influence of any drug. Whereas marijuana, pills, and especially LSD were making me lazy, stupid, antisocial, paranoid, and pretty useless to anyone except people in the same condition, alcohol took me over the top. And the top, for me, would always be some form of violence. I had always hated violence in other people, but now I was finding out that I absolutely despised it in myself. Previously, I hadn't even thought myself capable of hitting or kicking another human being, least of all someone that I cared about. Little did David know that after our very first fist fight, our days together would be numbered. The one person on this planet that I was not going to become was Billy Jackson. Figuring out how to end the relationship was not going to be hard. David came home one night flying high on acid, alcohol, and I don't know what else. Probably angel dust too, because he was as strong as a bull. Whatever it was, it took him way, way over the top. David went into a rage, the likes of which I hadn't seen since my childhood, breaking and smashing everything in sight, clawing and screaming like a wild animal. I didn't know what to do. There was broken glass everywhere. I knew somebody was going to be hurt badly if I didn't do something. Suddenly, it came to me. I rushed David, picked him up, and literally threw him out the front door and locked it. Fortunately, there were no front windows to the apartment, but he tried to kick down the door. And then, nothing. David was gone. He must have heard the sirens. This was to be the way that my first real relationship ended. However, there was still one last bizarre scene to be played out. On the very same night that David took off running from the cops, he got on a bus headed for San Francisco. I got a couple barely legible letters from him there. I could tell that he was really drugged out. After all, he had worked as a secretary, and I couldn't even make out his handwriting. David had messed up bad, but I felt absolutely horrible about the way things had turned out. After all, who was I to throw him out of his own apartment? He had certainly paid more rent there than I ever had. No, what I had done was not right. Even if he did do too many drugs one night and lose it, who was I to judge? That's all we ever did together, drink and do way too many drugs. So he could come back, I told him, but our relationship was over. The plan was that David would move back to LA, get on his feet, and then either one or both of us would move out and get our own apartment. When he got back to LA, David was a fright. He looked like he hadn't been asleep since he left town 2 months earlier. His face was skeletal, and his eyes were ringed with deep dark circles. We were just 22-year-old boys at the time, but David looked to be twice that. And when he unpacked his duffel bag, I instantly understood why. There were literally hundreds of tiny little purple pills in different places all through his stuff. I had never seen so much acid in my entire life. I guess it was true that the hippies were still alive and well in San Francisco. Of course, we had to celebrate David's return to Hollywood. He could always sleep tomorrow, right? As I started to put one of these tiny purple pills into my mouth, he caught my hand. "No, much better to put it in hot tea," he said, and he went into the kitchen to prepare the magic elixir. Imagine the absolute terror that ran through me when I got to the bottom of the teacup and saw that there were 7 of the tiny pills resting in the bottom. This was not going to be good. The pills themselves were not acid. Liquid LSD was poured over the hard pills. I had just taken 7 hits of acid. In all the times I had taken this drug, there was never even one instance where I had taken more than one pill or tab. Had I just been murdered? I wondered. Was this the real reason he had come back? For revenge? But this was no time to be having bad thoughts. I only had 15 to 30 minutes before all hell was about to break loose in my head, and break loose it did. To this day, that night rates in the top 5 of the worst nights of my entire life. Needless to say, I had some serious trust issues with David after that. Was he dangerous? That was my primary concern. Because he was still there the next day and in the weeks and months to come, I must have bought his story. He did make one very good point. He had drunk from the very same cup that hellish night, and nothing had happened to him. What kind of a drug tolerance was this? I felt like I had just returned from the outer limits, while he thought that stuff was so weak that it took 7 pills just to feel anything. Whatever my concerns about David and his motives, they would have to take a back seat. There had been several changes made on the home front since that fateful night that he went running off to San Francisco. 1, I had gotten a roommate to help out with the rent. 2, I had finally broken down and gotten myself a job. Can you believe it? And 3, I had met Jimmy, the man who had proved to be my one experience with love. But the drama was not over, not by a long shot.
Oh, y'all. I think we had
Chapter 4.
Oh, we had
Alcoholic.
Hold on, y'all. Y'all, this heavy. Now, this heavy now, y'all. This heavy.
Jimmy came.
Y'all, I had to go off camera and smoke me a damn cigarette. This was heavy. This is heavy. Because I liked him. You know? And it's funny because, you know, he's an older man, and I always believe that gay men have it worse. For whatever reason, even when you be a lesbian, people accept you more as a lesbian. I don't know if they deny the fact that you are a lesbian or whatever, but people accept you more as a lesbian. But gay men, they have it the worst. And my thing is, he had all that domestic violence stuff going on with like his stepdaddy, and then the white man that he got with was drugging him. But y'all, see, now with that, I can relate to Tim with that. Growing up in South Mississippi, being a lesbian, my first girlfriend that I had was white. And the crazy thing is, she got strung out on, I think it's called speed. I don't know if speed is the same thing as meth, but she was on that bullshit. Now, for me, like, I drank with her before, but I couldn't imagine drinking with her and then looking at the bottom of the cup and it's 7 pills up in there because somebody put 7. Y'all, I couldn't imagine that. But it's crazy because, yeah, she got herself strung out. She look horrible now. I can't even believe I dated her. But I met her up in college when I was at the community college, y'all. I was at community college. And that was my first little girlfriend. And yeah, now she bad off now. And it sounds like Tim wouldn't have made the choices that he made if he didn't get with David. David put Tim on the wrong path. Which I don't fault Tim, because I wonder, you know, could I have gotten on the wrong path? You know, I wonder. But like, y'all, I wasn't about no drugs. And so it's fucked up though. But either way, y'all keep baiting me into another chapter. I came on here with chapter 1 only, and now we about to be at chapter 4. We about to be at chapter 4 now. Now I already got on my bathrobe and all that. Yeah, in South Mississippi, my first girlfriend was white. So Tim, I understand that. Like, white people will introduce you to the craziest stuff if you let them. And it's not me placing judgment on Tim. But white people be bringing stuff to us sometimes that we never even thought of. But for me, I just always remember my mama telling me, that I have to look out for myself. I have to look out for myself. And so that's the reason why I couldn't let the white girl that I was with, even though I was 19, I was just 19, y'all, but I couldn't let her deter me or lead me down the rabbit hole just because I like the cooch. I couldn't let her do it. So it's interesting listening to this. 4 and 5? No, Simply, no, you late. Simply, you gotta catch up to the other ones that we done did. Girl, I've been on here for an hour and 15 minutes. I'm tired. We'll go to chapter 4, y'all, but I'm tired. Damn. And y'all, please like my video. Thank you. Please like my video. Thank you. Johnny Cage, I thought that I was gonna do like maybe 1 or 2 chapters, but now we about to be at 4. These people want to finish this book tonight, and I'm tired. But I am interested in knowing more about Tim, because I met Tim in real life in person whenever we met in Atlanta. And that's the thing, y'all. I'm such a small YouTuber to Tim. He didn't even know who the fuck I was. Like, y'all, I had walked through that door and I recognized him, but he didn't know who the hell I was. But like, even whenever he didn't recognize my ass, you know, he still greeted me with a smile and gave me a hug and all this kind of stuff, you know. Meanwhile, I knew about his life, but he didn't know me. And he was very respectful. Even with the show shit, Tim has been so respectful to me. And that's why me listening to this book is not a drag. I can understand that some people think that this book is about tea, but I'm not here for no tea. I really want to understand this man. I want to understand. I want to learn, but then also because I'm gay too. So me listening to this is really showing me that even though he is a gay man and I'm a lesbian, we have a lot more in common than what we do, or than what we don't. Not only that, but I grew up in the South. He grew up in damn Indiana and then California. And even in Indiana and California, we would consider that being from up north, but he still had problems. So, you know, sometimes whenever we actually listen, we can learn more about each other than what we think. So that's what I'm trying to do with this. I'm not here to drag Tim or nothing. I'm just listening to be more aware and understand. But either way, y'all, I'm doing 1 more chapter. And after chapter 4, I'm done. Until Wednesday, y'all. Until Wednesday. We'll go through chapter 4. Let's get through chapter 4.
Into my life and help out with the rent. And nothing had happened to him. What kind of a drug tolerance was this? I felt like I had just returned from the outer limits, while he thought that the stuff was so weak that it took 7 pills just to feel anything. Whatever my concerns about David and his motives, they would have to take a back seat. There had been several changes made on the home front since that fateful night that he went running off to San Francisco. 1, I had gotten a roommate to help out with the rent. 2, I had finally broken down and gotten myself a job. Can you believe it? And 3, I had met Jimmy, the man who had proved to be my one experience with love. But the drama was not over, not by a long shot.
I think we at
chapter 4.
Okay, we at chapter 4. Okay. I'm going off camera,
Jimmy
but I'm still
came
here.
into my life in the summer of 1980. I was 22 and he was 29. That's quite a difference in gay years. I won't say that it was love at first sight, but there was something significant that moved between us right before he passed out. We met at the Rusty Nail, West Hollywood's one and only interracial hangout. That's not to say that there weren't black folks hanging out in the other bars. In most, there were usually 3 or 4 of us. Yeah, that's about right. 3 or 4 black guys and 1 to 200 whites. Now, I'm not suggesting that this meant that the entire community of West Hollywood was racist, but it did cater overwhelmingly to white men seeking the company of other white men. The Rusty Nail was different. This was a bar that, at least in 1980, marketed itself to black men who were into whites and to white men who were into blacks. The Nail was where David and I had gone whenever we went out, and it was there that I met my second lover, Jimmy. When I look back over my life, even today, I believe that Jimmy is the only person I ever really loved. We went home together that first night and we had what I thought was a good and memorable time. 2 weeks later, however, when I ran into him again, he didn't even know who I was. As it turns out, when we'd met, he'd been in the middle of an alcohol-induced blackout. So what could I do? I let him pick me up for the first time all over again. A mild-mannered bank teller by day, Jimmy was a rip-roaring alcoholic by night. He was the kind of guy who would sit on a bar stool until either he fell off or the bartender cut him off. That was how Jimmy drank. When he wasn't drinking, Jimmy was a kind and gentle, generous and loving, spirited guy. In fact, Jimmy wasn't a bad guy when he drank either. Just what you might call sloppy. And man, oh man, did that dude have a roaming eye. Jimmy had been a heroin addict as a teenager, but at the time we met, he was 8 years clean, at least from heroin. Coming from all that, I guess he saw his drinking as child's play, and I suppose he had a point in a way. I mean, everybody drinks, right? Besides, how could you be gay if you didn't drink? The bars were the social center of our world. Jimmy thought it hysterical that I could actually get falling down drunk on just 3 drinks. He, on the other hand, would arrive at the bar at about 8, locate a stool with a view, place 2 packs of cigarettes on the counter, and then sit there and drink until the lights came up. This didn't happen every night, however. Jimmy may very well have been in denial about his alcoholism, but on one point he was very clear. After he started drinking, he couldn't stop, and in the adult world, bills still had to be paid. So both of us had to somehow get up and make it to work Monday through Friday. For that reason, and that reason alone, most of our partying took place on the weekends. And that was okay by me, just as long as I still had my old standby. I was still smoking weed every single day and taking LSD or MDA whenever I could. Jimmy, on the other hand, hated all drugs. Heroin had almost killed him. In fact, it had killed his mother, who died of an overdose when he was 21, and he had been clean ever since. If there was one single thing that Jimmy did not like about me, he absolutely hated the fact that I liked to get high. Of course, alcohol was different. I'm not sure why I found Jimmy so fascinating in the beginning. Maybe it was because he was older and seemed to know so much more about everything than I did. Or maybe it was the way he lavished so much attention on me. I had never experienced that. David and I had been just boys, and we loved each other just the way boys do. But Jimmy was a man, and soon I was falling in love with him. He was falling too, a little slower than me perhaps, but falling nonetheless. So this is what it felt like, I thought. How could the world hate us for this? What could be more natural for us? Meanwhile, things were getting a little crowded at home. First, there were Jimmy and I, who wanted very much to be together all the time. Then there was David, my ex, who still had some lingering idea that we were somehow going to work things out. And finally, there was Levi, the roommate that had moved in, taking David's place. And all of this in a 1-bedroom apartment. Of course, Jimmy and I could have and should have waited a while before trying to live together. He was still quite a ways off from making any real commitment, and in this way at least, Jimmy fit one of the oldest stereotypes about gay men. Very early on, I began noticing that he seemed to know pretty much every black man at the Rusty Nail. Why, I wondered, did they all seem to have something to whisper in his ear? Then there were the phone calls taken in the other room, with the door closed. Then my friends started telling me things. Of course, to me it was all malicious gossip and I didn't want to hear it. They're all just jealous, I thought, because I have somebody and they don't. Oh well, just because the people were gossiping about it didn't mean that it wasn't true. And after I walked in on Jimmy and David in bed together, it was ridiculous to deny it anymore. This was no accident. I already knew that David had a dark and vindictive side. But what in the world was Jimmy's problem? Surely he knew how much this would hurt me. Back then we used much harsher terms, but today Jimmy would probably be considered a sex addict. That's among the more sensitive and compassionate circles.
Jimmy and
To the rest of us, he
wow.
would still be considered well, let's just say a very promiscuous person. This didn't make him a bad guy necessarily. In fact, in the gay world, it didn't even make him an unusual guy. But relationship material? Any rational person would have seen the signs and headed for the hills.
Oh, wow.
But I wasn't a rational person. I was 22. A series of circumstances left Jimmy in need of a place to live, so I, of course, had to take him in. After all, he was my boyfriend. David still hadn't gotten on his feet. Levi had come to my rescue and David had taken off, so I couldn't just throw him out on the street. And that's the way that the four of us came to live in the same one-bedroom apartment. Of course, this would never work, especially after that stunt David had pulled, which naturally had been blamed on the alcohol. But of course, I was just too naive and immature to understand this, and Jimmy never seemed to tire of reminding me, Tim, we're not lovers, and we are both free to do whatever and whomever we want to. Well, that was just great and oh so convenient for him. But I was not a sex addict, and I did not think it strange to expect monogamy between two people who claimed to love each other. I was coming to realize that there were certain aspects of this new carefree gay lifestyle that I despised. Adding to my troubles, I knew that David was by no means finished. He would never rest until he had finished breaking us up. How foolish of me to believe that the three of us could share the same space, even temporarily. It wasn't long before we were all evicted for lack of payment of rent and for our outrageous behavior. Can you believe it? 4 grown men living in a one-bedroom apartment and we still couldn't pay the rent. Now I needed an apartment and a roommate, and Jimmy needed an apartment and a roommate. Rents were high in LA even back then, too high to get a place on my own. So Jimmy and I were faced with a decision. Dare we try to live together? No one thought it made any sense. Granted, we were calling ourselves boyfriends, but there was no real commitment. Jimmy loved his carefree and promiscuous lifestyle, and it was all out in the open now. I had even learned to pretend that I liked sleeping around, which of course was a humongous lie. I only wanted to be with him, but I was not about to humiliate myself and let him know that. Still, we both absolutely loved each other's company. I got Jimmy's humor and he got mine. We laughed about all of the same things. I found him an irresistible companion. Sometimes he seemed to understand me better than I understood myself. If ever there was a relationship based on laughter and companionship, it must have been ours. So we did it. Jimmy and I got an apartment together, a really nice apartment right in the heart of West Hollywood, LA's gayest neighborhood. On the surface, it looked like we were a pretty happy couple of guys. We even got a doggy. But just under the surface, we both understood that we were living in a glass house, and at the first sign of trouble, this whole facade was bound to come crumbling down on our heads. Part of Jimmy wanted to stay home and play house with me, and the other part still wanted to be Peter Pan, inasmuch as he never wanted to grow up. For my part, I was probably just as fickle. One day I'd want to stay with him and somehow work out our problems, especially our problems around monogamy. And then the very next day, I'd want to be done with the whole charade so that I could get on with the business of finding a good man. Surely every gay man in the city of Los Angeles wasn't a very promiscuous person. The booze helped. At least at first it did. In fact, we were practically living in the bars. I mean that both figuratively and literally. We lived within a block of 6 gay bars, and I was a regular in every one of them. But Jimmy preferred the scene back in the old neighborhood. He also preferred to go there alone. Even if we didn't drink together very often, we certainly did everything else as a couple. This was all very confusing for me. I mean, were we in a relationship or not? I can remember being paranoid about people laughing at me, especially at our only mutual hangout, the Rusty Nail. Looking back on it now, I can see that I probably wasn't paranoid at all. More than likely, they really were laughing at me, especially the ones that were sleeping with my boyfriend. One day I came home from work to find that Jimmy had moved out. I guess he'd finally had enough of me calling him a whore. That and the fact that I know that he really did care for me. The guilt that he must have felt over the way things had turned out had to be eating him alive. Rather than drag out the inevitable, he simply chose to leave. I can't say that I was really all that torn up over his decision either. Sure, I cried that first night when I discovered that his clothes were no longer hanging in the closet. But the very next day, my old roommate Levi moved in, just like he had when David took off for San Francisco. And then, not 2 weeks after that, I went and got myself another boyfriend. When Jimmy found out that this guy had moved in to what just a few weeks ago had been our apartment, he went ballistic. "What kind of a person are you?" he demanded. "How could you have moved this creep into our apartment? How could you actually be living with somebody else just 3 weeks after we broke up?" Who knows? Maybe I was just playing mind games. But if that was the case, it must have been on a very subconscious level. As far as I was concerned, Jimmy and I really were toast. And this new guy, whatever his name was my new beau. After all, Jimmy was the one who chose to leave. Maybe none of the people involved were very clear on each other's motives, but whatever was going on, it worked. A week later, Jimmy was back and Loverboy was now toast. Jimmy and I were now officially lovers. I've got to hand it to him, he really did make pretty close to a 180-degree turnaround. Suddenly, Jimmy and I were a committed couple. The dog was finally being properly parented, and I'd have to say that, in a general way, we were happy. The problem was, we drank. Within the first year of our new life together, I had totally caught up with his drinking. It wasn't like I was trying to become an alcoholic because he was an alcoholic. Frankly, I preferred drugs. But the more I got caught up in the bar scene, the more I drank. And the more I drank, the more I got caught up in the bar scene. Drinking and going out just seemed to me to be what gay life was all about. I wasn't the only person that felt that way. The gay bars around West Hollywood, and all over Los Angeles for that matter, were always packed. Before long, I was drinking pretty much every night. The nights that I didn't go out, it was either because I was broke or because I simply needed to rest. Of course, I only needed to rest so that I would be ready for the weekend. The bars were for weekdays, and all of my weekends were spent at the discos. I don't know if I was more hooked on going out every night or on the booze itself. For me, there was never any separation. Every time I had a drink, I was in a bar. In fact, Jimmy and I never had so much as one bottle of alcohol or even a beer in the apartment. It's really pretty amazing when I think about it that we managed to stay together as long as we did. It was towards the end of our 3rd year together that things started spinning out of control. I didn't like being drunk so much anymore. At first, it had been a lot of fun. I'd get really friendly, laugh really loud, tell lousy jokes and lies until last call for alcohol. But after only 3 years, the alcohol started affecting me differently. Whereas before I had been generally considered by most people a happy drunk and a pretty darn nice guy, now I was becoming more and more sarcastic, as well as bitter, obnoxious, angry, paranoid, and just downright mean. Even I absolutely hated the way that I would get after a few drinks, and yet somehow I couldn't seem to stop it. I tried taking caffeine pills and later various kinds of amphetamines, all in an effort to not get quite so drunk. But after a while, this only made things worse. Mixing amphetamines and alcohol only made me a wide-awake drunk and just as mean as a scorched alley cat. None of this was the reason that Jimmy and I finally broke up, however. No, the beginning of the end came for us when I started noticing bruises on his body. Oh God, this was too much. Wasn't it enough that I was born black and poor, had no father, and gay? Did this mean that I would always be alone too? Oh God, this was not fair. Didn't I already have nothing? At that time, I was far too ashamed to tell anybody, even Jimmy, about my real beginnings or about all of the domestic violence that I witnessed as a small child. But when I saw those bruises on his arms and stomach and realized that I didn't even remember hitting him, it was like being back in that house with Billy Jackson all over again, except this time I was Billy. I knew I would rather be dead than to become what my stepfather was. Intuitively, I knew that things would only get worse. Thankfully, Jimmy moved out again, and the very next day, I went to Alcoholics Anonymous. The first time I tried to get clean and sober, I was 25 years old. Jimmy and I had just broken up, and I was hurting bad. Not only was I giving up alcohol, drugs, my beloved bar scene, and Jimmy, I was also being evicted again. There was a thriving, clean and sober gay community in and around West Hollywood back in 1983. There were even a few black people, 4, if I recall correctly. But I could be wrong. There may have been as many as 5 of us. But in all honesty, at that time in my life, I actually preferred being around all white folks. My unresolved issues around race and culture were numerous, legion, you might say. And adding to this dilemma, after I started getting high, I stopped growing up. After all, what was the point? Why should I have to work through my problems, educate myself, seek help or guidance? It was so much easier to just take something or drink something or smoke something. So much easier to feel nothing. My first experience with Alcoholics Anonymous was a very good one. I was one of those people who just loved to go to meetings. Finally, I had found a place where I could actually discuss my problems. Finally, a place where I could rediscover myself and begin to unravel all of the junk that I had been suppressing and medicating for all of my young life. It was through listening to all the personal stories that I listened to night after night that I began to realize that I wasn't so different after all, that I experienced both joy and sorrow pretty much the same way other people did. What I was amazed to find out was that I had experienced many of the same challenges in life that other dysfunctional people had. No doubt about it, AA was great for me, but giving up drugs and alcohol forever was no simple matter. No wonder so much emphasis was put on doing it one day at a time. The very idea of never getting high again was enough to send me into a panic attack. Granted, I was at an all-time low when I stumbled into the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous. And granted, I had probably never been as happy or content in my entire life until after I started going to meetings. But my drinking and drugging were by no means over. Not by a long shot. My primary stumbling block back then was my age. I just couldn't seem to get around feeling like I was missing out on something, like I was giving it all up way too early. After all, I was only 25 years old when I got clean. In fact, my whole using career from beginning to end had lasted a total of 5 years. The old timers used to say, "I spilt more on the counter than you drank." After a while, I started to wonder if maybe they might not have a point. Maybe I wasn't a real alcoholic after all. Maybe I could just blame this whole thing on Jimmy. After all, wasn't he the one who had been making me so bitter and hostile? No one could deny the fact that I had come to my first meeting the day after he moved out. Funny, all of the things your mind will come up with when you want to drink. But be that as it may, after my 3rd or 4th relapse, the verdict was in. I was indeed alcoholic, and Jimmy had nothing to do with it. Somehow I managed to stay clean for about 2.5 of the next 3 years. My program, if you could call it that, mostly consisted of going to AA and NA meetings every day. I will never be able to honestly say whether 12-step groups would or would not have worked for me. The very term 12-step implies that there are 12 steps to be taken. I never really got past step 1. Still, on the surface, things seemed to be going well for me. I had a pretty decent job, my own apartment, and I was positive that I was HIV negative. This latter thing I could surmise only because I had somehow managed to go 2 full years without any sexual contact at all. Besides, LA was the last of the big cities to be hit by HIV. Or was it? This was only my perception based on the conversations I was having at the time. I believe that at first, many of the men in recovery felt like we had gotten lucky, that we had gotten clean just at the right time. After all, none of us were using or drinking or sleeping around like we used to. We all had the presence of mind to wear condoms and stay away from the bathhouses. I, for one, felt like my own chances of contracting this new virus were pretty close to nil. And then people started getting sick. The very first person I knew who died from AIDS had been clean and sober for 6 years. These were terrifying times for me and for everybody that I knew, especially when the media started talking about incubation periods of up to several years. How could anybody really feel safe, whether they were clean or not? Every cold, flu, blister, everything and anything was suspect. Fear had gripped our community. To make things worse, we didn't even have the benefit of knowing exactly how this thing was spreading. There was lots of talk going around about drug use and about one drug in particular. As it turned out, this was one of the few drugs that I hadn't gotten around to when I was out there. Apparently, many of the people who were getting sick around the program were former crystal methamphetamine users. I do remember hearing about crystal meth back when I was still partying, but frankly, it was just too expensive for a guy like me. I couldn't even conceive of the idea of paying $40 American for a few tiny granules of anything. No, speed was just a means by which I could stay awake and drink all night. The kind of amphetamines I was taking cost only $2 or $3 a pill. Now here I was being inundated with all of this information about this other epidemic that I barely even knew existed. And it's not all that surprising that I didn't hear much talk about this particular drug around the bars. Crystal wasn't nearly so much about going out as it was about staying in. The common denominator between crystal meth and AIDS was twofold. One, it was about using needles. And two, it was about sex. Lots and lots of sex. While it was true that not everybody that used meth used needles, it became apparent to me that virtually every gay man that used crystal meth had outrageous amounts of sex. I know that this kind of generalization is likely to tick some people off, and I'll have to concede that this was the perception of a man who hadn't had sex at all in over 2 years. This was not a condition that I willingly chose to be in. Frankly, I was both sexually frustrated in the extreme and paralyzed with fear of AIDS at the same time. Now, you would think that this early association between crystal and AIDS would serve as the ultimate deterrent, and you would be right to think that. Any rational person would be thinking along those lines, but rational thinking had never been one of my strong suits. Still, I believe that because I was clean and in my right mind most of the time, I didn't just run out and try crystal meth so I could get laid. At least it didn't happen that quickly. I wasn't the only one having brain trouble. Jimmy was back on heroin. I should have known that he was in trouble when I heard that he started hanging out with this known junkie shortly after we broke up. He had been off of smack for over 11 years. How could this have happened? His using again after all those years was by no means the worst part of the news, however. The very worst part was when his using partner became the second person that I knew to die from AIDS. Jimmy and this guy had shot up and shared needles practically every day. Another unfortunate series of events found me in urgent need of a place to live. Okay, I was being evicted again. I had learned to keep a job, and I no longer used drugs or alcohol, but I had yet to master the art of paying my bills. So here I was sleeping on Jimmy's couch. The two of them would be locked away in the bathroom, shooting up heroin and plotting their next scheme to get more money. And I'd be in the living room reading my AA Big Book. Of course, this whole scenario made no sense. I had no business being there. Before long, I was back hanging out with my old friends. Jimmy's friend got very sick, and soon after that, he died. Not long after that, Jimmy was in jail for petty theft and possession of heroin. And then, once again, the landlords were banging on the door. This time, I didn't just find another place to crash. This time, I got loaded. At first, I just walked into a bar on my lunch break and ordered a beer. But then, you guessed it, the first chance I got, I bought my very first bag of crystal methamphetamine. A monster is born. Chapter 5.
Tim Blaine, don't do it. No, I'm ready to go, Tim Blaine.
It is an awful
Tim Blaine,
thing when
I'm ready to go. Todd.
A person is reduced to defining their life.
Y'all, why did I know it? When I heard that man, I knew that chapter 5 was going to be about the meth, y'all. I knew. I'm tired, y'all. Hi. My Fitbit vibrating on me, telling me to walk around. And y'all, I've been sitting here for almost 2 hours. Oh my God. Octavia, I'm not a marathon person like this. I'm tired. I was supposed to just do chapter 1 for y'all. And now I done already been through 1, 2, 3, 4. Grammy love. My God. Yeah. Don't make me cry like Jay Speaks. I'm going to do chapter 5 and that's it. Like, I don't want to be out here for 2 hours. I'm tired. I'm welling. Lavender spirit, I'm welling. Y'all better promise. Now, if we go through chapter 5 and then Timothy Blaine say that he done did heroin next, you better not make me stay on here for chapter 6. You better not. Because I'm going to come back with the rest of the chapters. I'm going to come back. Girl, I don't know how many chapters, Margot, but it seemed like they want me to get through the whole chapters in one book. Look, I can't do it in one sitting, y'all. I can't. ZT, you still up in here laughing? ZT, they pressuring me. Stop pressuring me. Hey, stop pressuring me. Stop pressuring me. You make me wanna scream. Da 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 da. Do da 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 da. Da da da. Do da 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 da. Da da da. Do da da da. Da da da. Make me wanna scream. Stop pressuring me. Okay, y'all. Chapter 5 gonna be the last one. And the thing is, after chapter 5, y'all, I'm gonna turn this live off. Like, I don't even care. I'm not even gonna wait for y'all to give me y'all opinion. Because y'all taking my kindness for a weakness. Y'all take my kindness for weakness. Y'all take advantage of people. Y'all taking my kindness for a weakness. Meanwhile, I don't see y'all giving me no cash app or nothing. Y'all ain't trying to support over here. Let me see if y'all subscribe. Did y'all subscribe? I know, but Wednesday is plausible, Ivy, because I actually have to work for a living now. I work, I be working day and night. Well, okay, y'all. Chapter 5. And y'all, after chapter 5, I'm hanging up on y'all. I don't care. Y'all could act like y'all my friend today. I'm hanging up on y'all after chapter 5. I'm
Life
gonna
by
be
the
done with y'all.
drugs they take. But that
I'm
is,
gonna be done.
at first, I just walked into a bar on my lunch break and ordered a beer.
I'm
But
about to be done
then,
with
you
y'all.
guessed it, the first chance I got, I bought my very first bag of crystal methamphetamine. A monster is born.
Chapter 5. We at 5 now. Give me a high five.
Chapter 5. Meth Monster. It is an awful thing when a person is reduced to defining their life by the drugs they take. But that is exactly what meth did for me. Try as I might, there is simply no way for me to minimize the impact with which crystal meth slammed into my life, at least not without straying far from the truth. It was like throwing a 40-pound sledgehammer through a plate glass window. Mind you, I was not going into this thing totally blind. I had been coveting this drug and obsessing about this drug for a full 2 years before I got around to actually trying it. Of course, in the beginning, it wasn't such a bad thing. No, to the contrary, in the beginning, crystal meth seemed like the best thing that had ever happened to me. 3 or 4 days after I relapsed on alcohol, I found myself at a big dance bar in Hollywood. It was the weekend of the Gay Pride Parade, and the atmosphere was especially festive. I had been drinking every night since the day that I gave up my sobriety, and by Sunday morning I was very, very drunk. This particular bar was known for its all-day beer bust, which started promptly at 6 a.m. every Sunday morning. It was also the easiest place to find meth. And that's where it all began. I was already drunk and obnoxious, so what the hell? I just walked up to the first dude I saw who looked like he was dancing a little too fast for the music, and the next thing I knew, we were sitting in his car doing the deal. And then, not 10 minutes later, when I walked back into the bar, I had a sudden realization. I was no longer drunk. Just like that, I was in full control of my mind and all of my senses. There was another thing that I think was very significant about this maiden voyage into the underworld of meth. From across the dance floor, I spotted this really attractive young guy leaning over a balcony up above the smoke in the crowd, and I thought, this has to be the most attractive dude in the place. And do you know what I did? I walked right over to him and I introduced myself. And when we finally left that bar, we left together. Now, you would probably have to be me to understand that I could never have done that on my own, even with the help of alcohol. My fear of rejection had always been so intense that I rarely approached anybody. So what was this? Where was the fear? It sounds ridiculous, even to me, if I suggest that a person can be totally hooked on a drug from the very first time that they use it. So let me see if I can put it a different way. Nope, there is no better way to put it. I was hooked on meth from the very first time I used it. Hooked because I could not stop using it after the first morning at the bar. That first day I spent $10. The next day it was 80, and by the third day I was back in the department stores stealing to support my high. I want to digress here for a moment, because if there is one thing that I don't want to do, it is to spark anyone else's curiosity about this or any other drug. To this day, I still struggle with the fact that I first heard about crystal meth in 12-step meetings, but I believe that the Lord is calling on me to tell the whole truth, and I intend to do just that. So if you are a person who is still struggling to stay sober, or if all of this drug talk simply makes you uncomfortable, then hey, please skip forward, man or woman. That's what I would do. Ultimately, this book is about getting off drugs after all, not getting on them. That being said, those early party days on meth were admittedly a lot of fun. It seemed like I just literally danced right through the first few months. And then, just like with alcohol, there was a shift. That's the thing about what I call drug demons. At first, they just seem to do so much for you. And then, after they get you under their power, it's you that will do anything for them. One minute, I was spinning around on the dance floor just as free as an eagle in flight. And then, in what seemed just like the blink of an eye, I found myself sitting on the floor of a cockroach-infested abandoned building, trying to find a vein. But in fact, my flight from the dance floor to the nasty floor took about a year. I was still doing the club scene when I started going to jail. Way back when I was with David, I went to the county jail a few times, but now I was going all the time. I was what you would call a petty criminal at that time, and when I was arrested, 90% of the time it was for shoplifting. The whole thing had gotten a lot more desperate. At first, I just needed enough money to score one time. Then I would sell and barter what little I had to get more and more dope until I went to sleep 3 or 4 days later. Soon I couldn't sell any drugs. I was doing it all myself. And after I started shooting up, the party was essentially over. I didn't have time to be standing around in clubs. I needed $100 a day minimum to stay high. And as I began stealing more, jail became a second home. With each stint in jail, I came out knowing more and more of what I considered to be the real drug addicts. These were easily identifiable speed freaks. Many picked at their skin, wore dirty clothes, and for some reason always seemed to be looking for something on the ground. There was still a lot of pretense, a lot of acting as if around the club scene. True, many guys still had jobs, cars, and apartments, but many more were just pretending they did. I know that a lot of those guys were shooting up crystal just as much as I was, but talking about using needles was definitely taboo. The thing was, as long as you looked like you were holding it together, you could still find people who would give you drugs. For me, the final split between these two worlds came after a 5 or 6 day run with no sleep and very little food. I found myself pushing a shopping cart full of junk right past the front door of the most popular gay club in Hollywood, the very place where I had first scored some meth and spent literally every weekend getting loaded ever since. Needless to say, they'd never have to worry about seeing my face in that place again. When a person gets down to this level of drug addiction, their whole value system has to change. This new crowd that I was meeting, both in jail and on the streets, was anything but pretentious. Absolutely no one had a job, and absolutely no one that I ever met wanted one. Everybody had some kind of hustle. Some were dealers, others wrote checks, and some broke into houses and cars. Many, both male and female, were prostitutes. I myself was what the street folks called a booster, elsewhere known as a petty thief or shoplifter. This had always been what I reverted to whenever I needed money. When it came to boosting, I had always considered myself to be quite the pro, but one of the primary side effects of using meth, especially in the quantities that I was using, was that it made one extremely paranoid. Imagine walking into a department store and trying to steal something when you're already convinced that everyone around you, including small children and little old ladies, is either a cop or the FBI, and then try to imagine this being your only source of income. The streets were not a place where I ever chose to be, they were a place where I had to be. Maybe I wasn't as slick as I used to be, and I sure as hell wasn't as cute as I used to be, but I still needed money. And even more important than that, I needed drugs. That was the thing. Dope was more important than money. All money was good for was buying dope. In fact, my chances of getting ripped off were a whole lot greater when I used cash, and I soon came to realize that I could just bypass the money thing altogether. So at this point, I became the kind of addict that rarely, if ever, had any actual cash, but always had something to sell or trade. Believe it or not, I think I actually did better with the junk and stolen merchandise than the people spending money. In the streets, many, if not most people, picked up a handle or street name. If a guy specialized in stolen credit cards, his name would likely be something like Credit Card Bob or MasterCard Mikey. If stealing cars was more up his alley, then it would likely be something like Tony Toyota or Convertible Connie. People had all kinds of strange names. It was just smart to use a handle because everyone knew that tweakers, people who use meth, are notorious snitches, and cops use snitches like most people use oxygen. It just didn't make sense to let too many people know your real name. My handle was Jabber, because my real hustle was my mouth. I seemed to have a gift for making people like me, and after I got you to like me, I could sell you anything. In this phase of my long season in earthly hell, I became very much the meth monster. Every penny I could scratch together went for buying more drugs. If a hamburger cost $2, that was $1.50 too much. Everything I ate I either stole or got from charity workers. For a while, I lived in an abandoned camper that I had stumbled on during my many hours of prowling the alleys in search of something to steal. But in short order, I found myself literally living in the streets. I had no place to go, and I didn't care. All I cared about was where I was going to get my next hit. As for all of that uninhibited sexual freedom that I had signed up for, well, that turned out to be the cruelest joke of all. Who would want to have sex with a homeless bum? Rubbing filthy bodies together in filthy semi-public places was not my idea of a good time, not even in the drugged-out state that I was almost always in. Besides, who had time for sex? Getting and staying high was a full-time, all-consuming occupation. The only people I knew who still had any real sex life to speak of were the dealers, and that was only because they had the drugs to pay for it. Of course, a nice clean motel room with a bed and running water didn't hurt either. There were plenty of both guys and gals who peddled their bodies to the dealers. These were called bag chasers. If you were a rock star, you had groupies, and if you were a meth dealer, you most certainly had bag chasers. Tata, a 50-something-year-old queen I'd met in county jail, always had a posse of attractive young guys following him around. "Hey, Tata," I asked one day, "what's your secret?" He wrapped a rather big muscular arm around my neck. "Child, you're an old black man, don't nobody want you," Tata lovingly said. "What they want is what you got." Talk about transference. I happened to be 29 years old at the time. I later found out that Tata had been dealing crystal meth since long before most of us had even heard of it, and the wisdom he offered me that day was not very far from the truth. In this new reality, it didn't matter if I was 29 or 99. The only thing that really mattered was the dope and who had it. As with virtually all drugs, whether they be prescription, over-the-counter, or controlled substances, there are possible side effects. The ones associated with crystal are numerous. Two plagued me in particular. One was my inability to breathe normally. I spent countless hours hacking and coughing, trying desperately to catch my breath. This alienated me from even the people that were right there in the room with me. Over and over again, people would try to convince me that this reaction was all in my head and that there was in fact nothing blocking my air passages. But be that as it may, I simply could not breathe normally. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I did this hacking and coughing thing for hours on end. The second albatross around my neck was this seemingly unquenchable desire to collect junk. We called this trashing or dumpster diving. Now I know that some people who hear these words may be thinking, well, now this is getting a little silly. But for me to try to describe my many years as a meth addict and never say one thing about dumpster diving would be much more than a little silly. It would mean perpetrating denial and misinformation. I wonder if I had heard more about dumpster diving and less about hot sex, would I have found the idea of using crystal so irresistible? Well, one thing is certain, I sure as hell didn't sign on for spending hour after hour and sometimes day after day looking through other people's garbage. This was a strange and uncontrollable phenomenon, and as far as I could tell, it only affected speed freaks. This was also the way that I wasted the next 3 years of my life. I have no doubt that it would have gone on that way even longer if Jimmy had not gotten sick. There's something I want you to understand about Jimmy and me. Even though we had not been together for several years, and we had certainly gone our separate ways, we still very much loved each other. If Jimmy had been capable of monogamy, and if I had been capable of getting angry without hitting him, we would probably never have broken up. There had never been anyone after him. So when he got sick, I was devastated. AIDS was getting closer and closer to home. In fact, it couldn't get any closer than this. Jimmy was family. When I showed up at his doorstep after, yet again, being released from jail, he sat me down and told me that he had been very sick. He had full-blown AIDS. We cried together, Jimmy and I. In all the years that I had known him, we were never as connected as we were in that moment. I moved in with him that very night. This was not good news to his family. I'm sure that they saw me as nothing more than a drug-crazed opportunist. But Jimmy and I both understood very clearly why I had moved back in with him. The two of us being together at this time in his life seemed the most natural thing in the world. There were still problems, of course. At first, I was easily able to keep my street life and my home life separate. I figured that as long as I didn't bring any of my drug buddies or associates home with me, all would be well. But slowly over the next couple of years, as Jimmy's health deteriorated, I found it harder and harder to leave him at home alone. Since I couldn't get out there in the life found its way into Jimmy's living room. I had turned his apartment into a drug house. Jimmy deserved so much better from me. There were people there all the time. People making drug deals, people shooting up in the bathroom, people having sex in the kitchen. Jimmy was dying, and here I was carrying on like he wasn't even there. I thought for years that the next thing that happened was one of the worst experiences either of us had ever endured. But now, in hindsight, I think it much more likely some kind of supernatural intervention. It happened so quickly. I was almost never leaving the apartment. There was really no need to. Everything we needed came to us. I was high on meth every waking moment. Crystal meth is speed, and sometimes flying around and around in that tiny little apartment got to be too much. On those nights, usually while Jimmy was asleep, I'd go prowling around the basement of the building where we lived. One night, I varied slightly from this routine. There was a recently vacated apartment a couple of doors down the hall from us, so I figured, what the hell? Why not check it out? Maybe the people left something behind. The next thing I knew, the neighbors were banging at the door with their rather huge dog and the building manager in tow. Not 15 minutes later, the cops showed up. Maybe they would have just let me go with a warning if it were not for the fact that there was already a warrant out for my arrest. And that's the last time I ever saw Jimmy again. He was just sitting there on the bed, looking so incredibly fragile and confused, as they took me away in handcuffs. When I made it to court, I was hoping beyond hope that the judge would just give me a slap on the wrist for trespassing and continue my probation. I wanted so desperately to get back to Jimmy's bedside where I belonged. But that was not to be. I had somehow managed to slip and slide around the city and county jail system for years. It seemed like every time I went before a judge, I got a slap on the wrist and a threat of prison time if I came back. Well, the time for idle threats and short stays in the county jail had come and gone. This time when I went before the judge, he said, 3 years in the state penitentiary. Since I had been a thief in one capacity or another off and on since I was a child, prison had always been a very real fear for me. I think that all people who make their living on the wrong side of the law dread the coming of this day. That was the thing. After a while, everybody I knew either died, went crazy, or went to prison. And as if losing Jimmy and being sent upstate for 3 years wasn't enough, I had just tested positive for HIV. In 1991, testing positive did not mean the same thing as it does today. I had every reason to believe that I just might not make it out of prison. According to my lab tests, I had been positive for quite some time. Nevertheless, even more terrifying than the thought of dying in prison was the thought of living there as a gay man. I had seen all of the same movies that you probably have. If these animals were willing to rape a straight man, I thought, what in the hell would they do to me? When I arrived at San Quentin State Prison, you could have cut my fear and anxiety with a knife. Wouldn't you know that I would be sent to a place all the way at the other end of California? Just my luck. The one thing that I was counting on to make my stay there tolerable was the fact that I knew so many people who were already doing time. Well, that was in Southern California. San Quentin sat just north of San Francisco, where I didn't know a living soul. As it turned out, this is one time that being HIV positive actually worked in my favor. Positive inmates were segregated into a huge 100-man dormitory. I'm sure that if anybody were paying attention, they would have seen the tension drain from my face when I identified that over half of the people there were gay. Of course, there would be many problems and issues to come up over the next 2 years, but at least my homosexuality wouldn't be one of them. From what I understand, Jimmy died in a hospice right around the time that I entered the gates of San Quentin. I guess it was better this way. At least he got the care he needed and was able to pass away with a degree of dignity. I had been sentenced to 3 years, but only had to do about 20 months. When they called me for release in February of 1993, I had every intention of returning to Los Angeles and picking up where I had left off. I was actually kind of proud of myself for being able to complete a prison term at San Quentin. Somehow this made me feel more masculine and definitely more streetwise. I could hardly wait to get back to the old crowd with all of my lies and embellishments about prison life. But this was not to be. Inmates being released from a California prison are generally given $200 gate money. This is so that you don't hit the streets completely broke and desperate. As I was getting dressed in the release area, I was informed that since I was from LA, I would only be getting $100. This was to ensure that I did, in fact, return to Los Angeles. I could pick the rest up for my parole officer. Well, that may very well have been their intention, and I'll even concede that to a rational person, it would probably make sense. But I was not a rational person. I was a drug addict. And as far as I was concerned, 20 months was a long enough time between hits. I was not about to spend every dime I had on a bus ticket back to LA. Right there in that holding cell, while waiting to be released, I hatched another plan. To this very day, I've never returned to Los Angeles. As strange as it may sound, I was not nearly as excited about getting out of prison as I was about getting that needle back in my arm. Chapter 6, Dope Dealer.
Chapter 6, hold on.
When I arrived in San Francisco in February of 1993, I knew right where to go. Least, I hatched another plan.
Okay, y'all. I'm gonna let y'all go. Stop. Stop. Girl, the laptop. Girl, because I done made myself over here to go to my bed. And y'all, the laptop almost fell off my bed. It almost did. That's why I was like, wait. Yeah, I don't know why I was telling the laptop to wait. Because I was telling the laptop to wait, like, don't fall yet. Don't fall. But y'all, it's a lot. It's really a lot. Hold on, y'all. Hold on. Let me get comfortable. It's really a lot. Y'all ain't in front of my green screen no more. I'm tired. I don't want to sit up in there no more. Y'all, it's a lot. And it's really just messed up, you know. But we'll get through the end. I don't even think we had that much more to go now, because I think that the book is like 3 or 4 hours long on the Audible. It's only like 3 or 4 hours. And y'all, we already done got through 2 hours today. Oh, I'm writing my book. I've been writing my book, Bright Star. But I write my book and then I'll stop and then I'll start back and then I'll stop and I'll let it. So that's what I do. Well, Grammy Love, I'm actually one of the people on YouTube that actually work. Because there's a lot of people on YouTube that don't work. They don't work. I do work, Grammy Love. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this tomorrow. I don't know that I'm going to be able to. So that's why I said Wednesday, because at least I will be able to ballpark that. Like, you know, the people be saying I'm unemployed and all this kind of stuff. But my God, y'all, I have to do what it do. And the thing is, I hear Tim. What Tim was saying up in this book, I hear him. He was trying to survive. Now, I wouldn't have did the drugs like that, but I don't judge him for it. Because, I mean, he was in that time where that's what people were doing. I mean, if we're going to be honest, y'all, let's look at YouTube. The current day and age that we are in now, YouTube is very popular. What if YouTube was an addicting drug? Because, I mean, some people seem to be addicted off here already to where they can't even have a personal tragedy without putting it on here. And so when I think about how sometimes people seem obsessed with coming on here sharing every damn thing, and this is the day and age that we living in where that's what people do. I mean, hell, we saw Fi Baby get up in a car accident, and instead of her calling a lawyer, calling 911 first, y'all, she came on the live. And y'all could be Babe Nation. Y'all can be. But I do find it problematic that when you first up in a car accident, the first thing you do is come on the live. The fuck? The fuck? But the thing is, Tim, during those days, like the 70s and the 80s, you know, people was doing drugs and stuff. But for Fi Baby to be up in the car accident, she came on the live. Girl, ZT, I'm just like, the fuck? Like, if somebody hit my ass up in my car and I'm up in the car and I done got slanged around the car and shit like that, I'm not on here on YouTube to tell y'all about it. No. Now, at best, if I'm ever pulled over by the cops, which I've been doing this, if I'm ever pulled over by the cops, I will always go live on Facebook because I know that that's where my relatives are. Like, all of my relatives are on my Facebook. So if it's like life or death, I will go on my Facebook. But I damn sure wouldn't get up on the YouTube. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't. So, you know, people sometimes got to get they priorities in check. But the thing is, Fi Babe love to call Tim Blaine inmate 7779311 or whatever the fuck she said. But my thing is, this man he lived a remarkable life. You know, he got around David and Jimmy. They did him wrong. But I think he had an okay life, you know. And we're going to finish it up to see what happened in order for us to know the Tim Blaine that we know right now. But, you know, there was no way. Fi Babe got a lot of skeletons up in her closet. She just didn't write a book about it. Like, Tim Blaine put his skeletons right out here on the forefront. And I don't see how people can respect him for that. That's all I got to say about that. But either way, y'all, let me get off here. Thank y'all for joining me. Yeah, I will be back on Wednesday. So we got through chapters 1 through 5 today. And so on Wednesday night, probably at about 10 o'clock, I'll come back over here and I do chapter 6, maybe 6 and 7, because y'all, I do work during the week. I do. So we could probably do like chapter 6 and 7, and then I have to get off here. But either way, I don't want to rain on y'all's parade. I want y'all to be able to finish it through. But y'all, for real though, because y'all ain't hit my cash out. But don't hit my cash out. If y'all really enjoyed this book, hit up Tim Blaine. Because this is his life story. You know, I tried to ask permission to use, to not use him, but to do this on my channel. But his chat was having so much activity today that he didn't see none of the stuff that I said. Even when the moderators were trying to tell him, he didn't see it. But y'all, if y'all want to give $1 or 2 or 3 to somebody, give it to him, because we listening to his life. I don't know how many chapters, Johnny Cage, because it's an audio book. When you go through audiobooks, they just tell you how long the book is. But I don't know how many chapters. But right now, we already done did like 2 hours, and we only through the first 5 chapters. So I can only anticipate that there might be another 5 chapters later. Oh yeah, Dykes on the Loose tomorrow night at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please come see Dykes on the Loose on my regular channel. And then we have the after show on Houston Breads. But yeah, y'all, cash out Timothy Blaine. Give him some money. Cause y'all, we listening to his story. What else was y'all gonna do on this Sunday night? We done listened to this man's story, learned about the people that he loved, learned about him coming out the closet, all that kind of stuff. So the least y'all could do is just give him $1 or 2. You know, give him something. Do that. Especially if y'all going to be head over heels of finishing this book on here, then the least you could do is contribute to the man. That's the least you could do. But yeah, that's all I got to say. Y'all take care, be blessed, don't stress. Y'all, let me get my ass ready for bed. I done climbed up in this bed. But no, I'm going to take my shower and stuff. But y'all, thank y'all for joining me. Take care, be blessed, don't stress. Bye.